Next up is Bohemia Manor. And the Bohemia Manor community is created by a group known as the Labadists. And the Labadists were followers of the French preacher Jean de Labadie. To get a superior French pronunciation, please visit France. Alright, so de Labadie here was a famous, rabble-rousing, 17th century French dissenting preacher. France, remember, remained officially Catholic. And de Labadie was born into a noble family and raised inside Catholicism. He could have had a powerful position inside the French Catholic hierarchy. Instead, as a grown man, he started to criticize the whole system. He was a Protestant at his core. So he criticized many of the same things that we talked about Martin Luther criticizing. He criticized the Catholic focus on ritual. He criticized the Catholic idea of saints. He criticized the power of priests, the authority of the Pope. And all of those he shared in general with Martin Luther, John Calvin. But Labadie was also a supporter of communism, who argued that the true teachings of Jesus, and what does he point to? Passages from the Gospels and from the book of Acts. He says that communism is the proper way for Christians to live. He also emphasized the complete and utter sinfulness of humans, and that what people had to do then was pursue a life that was completely dedicated to God. He argued, and he gets a lot of this from the long dead Christian philosopher known as St. Augustine. He argues that all of the earthly, natural impulses of the body are evil at their core. Humans are sinful, and those natural human impulses are sinful. So, how do you resist that here on earth? You fight to control those sinful impulses. Like most Protestants, he argued, that you can't tell who God is going to save and who he's not. But he did think that when you saw people living in the way that he described, so these lives of self-denial, these lives of complete devotion, these lives where people withdraw from all the distractions of the material, completely sinful world. If people do those things and live like that, then there's a very good chance that they are part of the elect. That is, the ones who will be spared by God. No guarantees, but, the odds are good. Logically, he got into all sorts of trouble in France, but his noble birth and the fact that he appeared to have some great luck and find more powerful nobles who would protect him and shelter him at just the right moment allowed him to, keep spreading his message through the 1600s. He died in 1674. But by then, his followers could be found across Europe. In some ways, like the followers of Martin Luther could be found all across Europe. Some of his followers were considering building a colony in the New World to get away from all of the things in Europe that made it difficult to start a community from scratch. Some of his followers tried to establish a community in South America, in what would today be like Suriname, but that was basically a disaster. And so a couple of Labadists, as they called themselves, headed to North America to try to find a place to build a Labadist community. Now these men were from a Labadist community in the Netherlands. So, two Dutch fellows, Jasper Dankaerts and Peter Sluyter. Hey, for better Dutch pronunciations, please visit the Netherlands. Alright, so Dankaerts and Sluyter, part of a Labadist community in the Netherlands, come to North America to try to scout out locations for a community. 1679, they arrive in New York. Now, New York, remember, is at this point controlled by the English. But there are a lot of Dutch people here, right? Because the Dutch settled the area. The Dutch didn't all leave when the English took it over. But Dankaerts and Sluyter are both in New York, like on the down low. They are both using assumed names and not telling anyone, or being very careful about who they tell about their real mission. Because remember, back here in 1674, there's no religious toleration in New York at this point. They can be incarcerated. So, shh, be careful who we tell. They don't, like preach in public like we see later on after the Glorious Revolution when there's toleration everywhere. But they did, apparently, quietly, convert some people who they felt like they trusted. Most importantly, they managed to convert the son of a hugely wealthy landowner. Now that hugely wealthy landowner was Augustine Hermann. Augustine owned thousands and thousands of acres of land in what today would be Cecil County, Maryland. So you can see it in green on the map there. Today, it's like the northeast corner of Maryland. Augustine Hermann, from everything we can tell, was a sort of a swashbuckling, adventurous dude with really little interest in like strong religious morals. Augustine liked to party, to drink. He had a fabulous, wealthy mansion. He apparently liked women very, very much. And his son, Ephraim, was converted to Labadism by Dankaerts and Sluyter. Ephraim is converted to this sect of Christianity that preaches complete self-denial, no riches, preaches communism, and his dad's rich. I don't know if you guys ever knew about this, but often kids react against their parents. And maybe that's what was going on here. His dad, Augustine, granted his son and the Labadists a huge tract of land. So, sort of breaks it off from his land and gave it to the community. Apparently, Dad later regretted this decision, tried to back out. They had to take him to court, and finally the court said, yeah, like, you wrote it down. You have to give them the land. So they did. But when he finally gave them the land, he was angry with his son. And he told his son, you're not going to be able to handle this way of life. You're going to lose your mind. Ephraim had to leave his wife to go join the community. Because among the Labadists, you were only allowed to marry inside the Labadist community. The term for that is, the term for marrying outside the community is endogamous marriage. So, and that sort of marriage, marrying outside, was not permitted. So either his wife had to convert, or he had to leave her. And he left her. And Dankharts and Sluyter brought over from the Netherlands a group of about 100 people, men and women. And they're joined by Ephraim and a tiny number of other people here from Maryland, Pennsylvania. The community appears to have been dominated by Peter Sluyter. Now here, again, things get tricky with these communities from so long ago with scant sources. You read most of the accounts written by historians, and they emphasize what a hypocrite and a racketeer Sluyter was. But what are those based on? Well, they're based on two accounts from people who were in the community, got angry because they didn't like it, and left it. So logically, that's the way that they frame it. Alright, but here's what we can say about life inside the community. There was, according to Sluyter, absolute equality between the sexes. An incredibly radical idea for the 17th century. And yet, inside the community, the sexes stayed separate for meals and almost everything else. Everyone who joined the community turned over all their property. And, according to the rules of the community, you could not get your property back when you left. So it's a one-way decision. You join, you turn everything over, and then it belongs to the community for good. And you can see then why a couple disgruntled people leaving would be so angry. Sluyter preached in the Labadist tradition self-denial, or what's known as asceticism. Self-denial. The community grew tobacco and sold it. Tobacco, remember, a huge crop, Maryland and Virginia at the time. But Sluyter forbid people in the community from enjoying tobacco. It was an earthly luxury. There were, as Sluyter commanded, no fires for warmth. When you're cold, you enjoy the suffering. That brings you closer to God. Fires were allowed to cook food, right? But not just to warm yourself up. Be cold. The food was purposefully bad. I mean on purpose. They served a kind of gruel most of the time. There's some variation. But if you, as a member of the community, find something served to you that you particularly hate, then Sluyter orders that you get that all the time. They worshipped in silence, in Quaker-like religious meetings. with people sitting in silence, and sometimes Sloiter or other religious leaders, giving little bits of religious direction. In lots of ways, they were sort of like the Quakers. In fact, to people who lived around them and, didn't understand fine distinctions, people around them actually called them Quakers, often. But to Quakers who visited, this was a level of self-denial that the Quakers wouldn't recognize. The Quakers, at least lots of Quakers, believed there was nothing really wrong with the accumulation of riches as long as you did it in a way that fit with morality. Many of the things that we see here, the turning over of property when you join, and other things, are traits that we'll see in other communities as we go along. As time went on, one thing I should mention that's pretty great, not pretty great for him, pretty terrible for him. Remember your friend Ephraim, the young convert, who helped allow them to get the land and get this whole place started? Well, Ephraim felt so bad about leaving his wife that he left the community and returned to his wife. And then felt so bad about leaving the community and what he was doing to his soul that he went insane and died. Less than 2 years after joining the community. His dad died soon after. The Labadists retained their portion of the land. But as time went on, criticism of Sloiter escalated. Sloiter built himself a comfortable house protected from the elements. And Sloiter had fires burning on cold days. Sloiter told other members of the community that he was allowed to have a fire because he had achieved a level of spiritual perfection that they had not. They still needed to suffer. Sloiter also started smoking tobacco. The community had preached that slavery was wrong, yet Sloiter started owning slaves. And apparently, again, by people who did not like Sloiter, is recorded as being a particularly brutal slave owner. In 1698, so that's 15 years after its founding, in 1698, the community allowed for the private ownership of property. And about 25 years later, when Sloiter died, Sloiter was rich. The community itself finally disbanded in 1727. No community anymore, but private land ownership. Because so many of the accounts that we have, and we don't have very many, are not from insiders who stayed in the community till the end and believed in it, but from critics, from haters. And I think we all know, what are haters gonna do? Yeah, that's right. They gonna hate. Sloiter comes to us, really, as like America's first religious racketeer. Like a guy who set up a community with rigid rules and then didn't abide by them for his own comfort and wealth. Like I say, I don't feel 100% sure that in fact all of that is the truth. So if you're writing about all this, include the sort of bias in the sources, but nevertheless, that is the way he looks.